G'day guys, Mackie with the Outer Circle, and as I promised on Facebook, we have a special video today, What Broke the Fans? Age of Sigmar. Now, what a lot of people are going to expect when they click on this video is mass nerd rage at the dismembering of fantasy, or is it maybe love for our new Sigmarine overlords? Well, actually it's neither. Sure, I have contempt for the thing, but to be honest, I'm going to lay out some points here and provide some kind of group therapy. Let's look at why the change was made in the first place. Basically, everyone who had a fantasy army, the long-time gamers, they'd been building their armies for about 20 years, and had consistently amassed quite the force. Problem was, they didn't really need to buy anything new, because they'd been collecting for such a long time. And they rarely had any interest in actually starting a new faction and devoting another 20 years of solid buying to it. This meant that it was up to the fresh blood coming into the hobby to fuel the profit machine, and that simply wasn't happening. Now, since financial numbers are hard to get right, and since some asshole in the comments will always question a percentage figure, I'm just going to say sales were low. They were really low for Warhammer Fantasy. So if you're a company and you have to shake up the meta, try and encourage new blood into your game, try and encourage people who are already there, that they want to buy a new army, how do you do it? Do you try a thoughtful approach, garnering player feedback, making nuanced changes? Perhaps you look at your competitors and see what makes their games tick. Maybe look at Mantic's Kings of War, which was written by people who had originally written a lot of the fantasy materials. Or do you just come up with whatever system will net you a result quickly, for better or worse? Needless to say, they chose the latter. Now, going into the next section of the video, I'm going to be saying very bluntly how people felt. There's no right or wrong here, only the actual opinions held by people, and more importantly, why they held those opinions. So, how did Age of Sigmar impact the fans of fantasy? Well, I'd say the 7 stages of grief. Mostly hanging out around the anger part for quite a while. You see, to a fantasy player with 20 years invested into the hobby, it's like anything. If you do it long enough, you get into a routine, and you don't want too much change. Ever had a grandparent or parent say, "Well, this is the way I've always done it, that's the way it's always been done"? Well, that's the sort of thing going on here. The people in Warhammer Fantasy didn't want a huge change. They were really comfortable where they were. They didn't need new fluff because they liked their old fluff. Sure, stories change a bit from edition to edition, but you can recognise a lot of the fluff as near identical from edition to edition. To them, it was all washed away overnight, and they hated that. Now, to give some context here, it's like 40k players when Necrons went from Schwarzenegger's Terminator, these brutal killer robots with no emotion, into whiny emo space Egyptians. It was a sudden, massive rewrite of decades-old fluff that fundamentally changed the character of the race. It doesn't matter to them if their fluff still exists in some past or alternate reality. What matters to them is the here and now, and people resented the massive change. Next, you have the total rules, or lack thereof, overhaul, where everything changed. Every unit got new stats and worked a completely new way. In games like World of Tanks on PC, for example, they don't change the stats of their premium vehicles. That's the tanks and vehicles you've bought with real money. Because when they change a product you've already paid for, you actually have grounds for a refund. Because it's not the product you bought. Well, people bought fantasy with the set in concrete tagline that it's a large-scale fantasy battle. Strategy game. That's the tagline that was sold under for many years. When they got into the hobby, there was no suggestion of dropping to a small skirmish game. It was all about playing a big strategic game. A game where you use your wits to outmaneuver your opponent with large formations of infantry, of cavalry, supported by powerful heroes and war machines. You see, when this changed to a small-scale skirmish game with zero balance at all when it first came out, no points, a terrible bunch of gimmicky rules about, if you're wearing a hoodie or you have a hat on your head or you're wearing the colour purple or whatever, you basically had horrified the fans of fantasy. They were all wondering what the hell happened. They did, after all, expect a 9th edition that would be very similar to the game they had already. So now for them you have the cumulative effects of tearing down the fluff and the core concept of the game. And you wonder why people are pissed off. Why people literally torch their fantasy armies rather than sell them or have to look at them collecting dust on the shelf. That's how upset they were. And frankly, it is a perfectly logical reaction to be pissed off when someone shits on you like that. The thing was, what Games Workshop did was heavy-handed and poorly implemented. Fantasy players, I get you, I totally get you. Now that's out of the way, let's look at the other side, the pro-Sigmar side. For the people who weren't too invested into fantasy, Age of Sigmar is a welcome new addition. They don't have to fork out the incredibly vast sums of money, time, energy into building a fantasy army. They can instead just focus on a small army that better reflects their needs. They can also buy whatever units they like, there's no real cap on that. So if they want to collect vampires, and rather than having to build a huge horde of zombies, they might just choose to actually field a force of just vampires. I get that. The game itself is so simple and easy to learn that people could get into it straight away. 4 pages is quite a bit better than 400 pages or so in 8th edition, right? It's casual, it's simple, it's quick to learn, quick to get into. It's basically the perfect game for the casual end of the hobby. It also had some really cool sculpts, and it's going in a new direction. It's not stagnant like 40k and Fantasy both were, up until their respective end times began. Overall, there are a lot of positives with Age of Sigmar. So now I've presented both sides of the argument. Well, where do you go next in a video? Logically, I should point out that both sides could have been appeased with just a little more thought from Games Workshop in the first place. And, since the release of Age of Sigmar, a lot has changed at Games Workshop. The new CEO is taking it in a better direction. I find myself getting paused to saying a good direction, because there's a lot still to do in my mind before they can fix the last 10 years of fuck-assing about. They took on player feedback to some degree, and actually introduced a point system for some kind of balanced play, which I hear is actually quite good. Scenario play is another thing they introduced with goals and objectives, and you still have that original free-for-all system that the game released with. So overall, I'd say the system is actually on the up and up. This is of course not much help for the old hands. They miss their square base and they want that feeling of being Napoleon or Caesar. For the old hands, no matter what people say, your old world is dead. It's being retconned. It was like the Star Wars special editions, it damaged what came before. Games Workshop's your George Lucas. I do, however, suggest to you that you do give Age of Sigmar a go, and that if it's still not up to your cup of tea, which it probably won't be for many people, I would suggest that you maybe try Kings of War system, as it's really fucking good. Hell, they'll even let you use your old models, I hear. Even failing that, there's a fan-made 9th edition, which, again, I hear is pretty good. So there's options out there. Now, the last point I want to touch on is the finances. Did Age of Sigmar revive GW? Well, the financial figures coming out of GW say yes. Well, they say yes, but I dug a little deeper than the average shitposter on Facebook. I went out and I polled over 20 different forums and hangouts and found out what the most popular products as a whole were coming out of Games Workshop. They were boxed games. So, games like Blood Bowl, Space Hulk, etc., even on top of that, the Horus Heresy boxes, which weren't being used as games, which were being used to actually quickly build up the infantry in Horus Heresy armies. They sold big because of a host of factors, such as it being the only way to acquire certain characters or to get plastics at a decent rate. Age of Sigmar itself sold actually really well. You see, I found that fuck all people actually buy it, but those that do love it. Many that I spoke to said that they bought a box of Kelth, but also bought 4 to 6 times the cost of that in Age of Sigmar models. Well, you're talking thousands of dollars here of Age of Sigmar being bought by, one person. Of course, looking at the Sigmar prices, bit of sarcasm here, but that could just be 2 or 3 units for all I know, because the prices are ludicrous for some of these sculpts. Anyway, overall, Kelth and Prospero ran away with the large purchases people were making. They represented nearly half of all the sales from people polled. That said, as a final note on finances, a lot of the 30k stuff is purchased online or through third-party suppliers, and generally they don't want to deal with Games Workshop directly. Age of Sigmar, on the other hand, seems to do really well in the actual Games Workshop stores, and consequently many managers remarked to me that it was making up the bulk of their sales, which I think is very interesting to note. Anyway, at the end of all this, I hope I've given some perspective as to why people love and loathe what happened with fantasy. It's not easy for either side to give ground, but at least we can surely feel for the people who lost their version of the hobby. It sucks, and what truly worries me now is another heavy-handed swing at 40k trying to fix that, where all 40k really needs is just a few gentle taps in the right direction and a little grease on the squeaky wheels. So, as I said at the start, I think people expected me to go into this just whinging and whining about how, Age of Sigmar is the worst, or how Warhammer Fantasy was the devil, and Age of Sigmar is the best thing since sliced bread. Frankly, both statements are true. It's just finding a nice common ground in the middle. Nothing will ever make the people who were upset at the loss of fantasy happy. But, it's here to stay. There's no going back, I'm afraid to say. So it's either suck it up and move on, or stick with what you got. As always, thanks very much for watching the video. Leave your thoughts below, and we'll see you all next time.